Thank you very much for that introduction. So I'm going to just go ahead and start since you've heard the title of the talk. And I want to let you know that I have no financial conflicts of interest because I work for the federal government. So at the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, patients are at the heart of what we do. This is supported by our vision statement that patients in the U.S. have access to high quality, safe and effective medical devices of public health importance first in the world. This is also the underpinning of our strategic priority for this year, which is partnering with patients. This priority is a two-pronged approach to promote a culture of meaningful patient engagement by facilitating interactions between CDRH staff and patients, and secondly, to increase the use and transparency of patient input as evidence in our decision-making. This priority was born out of the evolution that we've seen in healthcare. In traditional medicine, patients were led by the provider towards their decision-making process of treatment. And now with the emergence of new diseases due to genetic testing advances, as well as the proliferation of information on the internet, patients are much more empowered and today are acting more in a shared decision-making capacity when deciding on treatments and other interventions. So the patients are now the co-pilots, not being led by the provider. They are using the devices and drugs at home by themselves. They are more involved in the decision-making process, and they are communicating and connecting with each other through social media and other forums. The patient advocacy groups are also much more organized and scientifically robust. They're developing eligible patient and longitudinal disease registries that can help facilitate clinical trial participation. And particularly this is important for rare diseases where there may not be a lot of patients, and helping to identify them helps to facilitate treatment for those populations. They're also training patient advisors to help improve the clinical study design and to conduct the study in a way that is more patient-friendly and efficient. So the regulators now have to take the time to listen to the people who are being impacted by our regulatory decisions. It's the patients. FDASIA, Section 1137, directs the FDA to develop and implement strategies to solicit the views of patients during the medical product development process and consider the perspectives of patients during regulatory discussions. This is the impetus behind CDRH's vision for a patient-centered device innovation and evaluation approach. There are multiple aspects of that approach, and I'm going to touch on some of them very quickly. The underpinning aspect of it, though, is the patient perspective. We need to listen and figure out what patients really want to have available as treatment options for their respective conditions. The definition of patient perspective is a wide definition. It can range from anecdotal comments and letters to the FDA, testimony that we hear at our advisory panel committee meetings, social media, blogs, or other web-based sources where they voice their discontent or content with certain devices and interventions, their responses to qualitative ad hoc surveys, and then formalized assessment of patient-reported outcomes, as well as value judgments of patients regarding the relative importance among different health outcomes. So how can the patient perspective inform the medical device development and evaluation? We know that it's important all the way at the beginning of the discovery and ideation phase. There have been a number of devices that have had to be completely retooled because the patient population they were planning on launching that device in didn't fit all their needs. For example, if a patient population has two comorbidities, let's say they have significant vision impairment as well as hearing impairment, a device that has small font and buzzes is not going to be helpful for them to know that there's a problem. So we have to look at it at the beginning of the device development. It's also part of the clinical trial process in terms of selecting the clinical design format, the endpoints, as well as assessing their experience with that device during the trial. It's important in our regulatory decision-making, and then once it goes into the market, we still look at patient-centered outcomes to ensure that it's meeting the needs of the U.S. consumers. At the FDA, particularly in the Centers for Devices and Radiological Health, in fiscal year 2015, 50% of our pre-market applications, and these are our high-risk devices, contained PROs. And this is a 300% increase over time, as you can see shown on the graph. When we look at the IDEs, our investigational device exemption, that's how you look at an investigational device in the United States. Those that were approved or granted the ability to conduct their study, you can see from the red bar that many of them are utilizing PROs. So the manufacturers have realized the importance of incorporating PROs in their device submissions. So let's talk a little bit about the science of patient input. And we're going to start first with patient preference information. CDRH has a very robust and actually visionary patient preference initiative. We are actually leading the agency on this particular topic. We have done studies partnering with the Research Triangle Institute to look at obesity measures in preference. And this informed the approval decision for a particular obesity device that was seen in a panel meeting about a year and a half ago. We have helped fund a public-private partnership with the Medical Device Innovation Consortium, who's put together a catalog of methods for looking at patient preference information. And then we've issued guidance documents. So our goal of our initiative is to develop a systematic way of eliciting, measuring, and incorporating patient preference information when it's appropriate throughout the total product life cycle, and to drive more patient-centric device development, evaluation, and delivery. We're seeking to, one, understand the barriers that patients have faced when they try to interact with the FDA. We're a big beast, and sometimes patients have no idea how to get in touch with us and let us know their concerns. And so we are trying to facilitate that interaction by holding disease-specific discussion groups with staff and patients to help them give a forum to voice their concerns. We also incorporate patient perspectives to help inform our benefit-risk decisions. And in order for us to consider that information, it has to be valid scientific evidence. And I'll talk more about this benefit-risk decision and how it's involved in the regulatory approval process. And we're also actively working to advance the state of science in measuring patient preferences. So if you think about a patient as a house, and they have biomarkers, they have demographic characteristics, they have blood pressure and glucose measurements, but they also have their own perspective. And that's kind of like the garage. And in that garage, you have the patient preference information and you have the patient-reported outcome measures. But they are not the same thing. Patient preferences are defined as qualitative or quantitative assessments of the relative desirability or acceptability of attributes that differ among alternative diagnostic or therapeutic strategies. And when we're talking about attributes, we're talking about what are the risks of using the device? What are the benefits of using the device, and what's the magnitude of that benefit? How tolerable are the side effects of the device? A patient-reported outcome, on the other hand, is defined as any report of the status of a patient's health condition that comes directly from the patient without interpretation by anyone else. So what do these two pieces of information tell us? Patient-reported outcomes are typically what we see as endpoints in our regulatory studies. They are outcomes that we also monitor in a post-market setting, and they're of interest to payers, providers, and patients. So I'll give you an example. In the world of ophthalmology, because I'm an ophthalmologist, so a lot of my examples are going to be in ophthalmology, there are classes of intraocular lenses that are put in patients' eyes following cataract surgery. Certain lenses are designed to help patients be spectacle independent. Not all of them accomplish it, but that is their intent. They have to measure that concept in the clinical trial, so it's an endpoint in our studies. They have to monitor it post-market, and some of these lenses also cause visual symptoms, which we look at in the post-market setting to see how much the visual symptoms are impacting that spectacle independence. And payers like CMS are very interested in whether or not the patient is actually spectacle independent, because if they are, it carves them into a different reimbursement category. So this is of interest to a lot of different healthcare entities. Patient preference information, on the other hand, inform those endpoints, like what is really important to the patient, and helps us to select tools that we may need to develop to measure that endpoint. They also help let us know what is the relevant effect size for the regulatory study. In some cases, it can inform the subgroup that may perceive some benefit relative to the risks that other groups may not weigh similarly. And we've used them in terms of labeling changes and expanding the indications. So I talked about this regulatory decision making, and just to kind of give you the broad strokes of how we look at device submissions. We look at the benefits and we look at the risks. And we use the fulcrum is all the information that is generated to support which direction we're going to lean. To help guide the benefit support, we've issued the patient preference guidance. It was finalized on August 24, 2016, and it applies not only to CDRH, but also to the Center of Biologics. This guidance document is for our high-risk devices, which are PMA devices, are humanitarian device exemptions, which are devices that are for a very small population of people, and de novo requests. A de novo is a device that we don't have a precedent for, but we don't think it's going to be very high risk. So it's a classification request. What we do is we have suggested in the guidance, what are the qualities of a good preference study? How do you collect it? And then how can you incorporate it in the labeling for patients and healthcare providers to make good decisions? We also emphasize that it is totally a voluntary submission. It is not, it's in addition to your clinical trial, not necessarily embedded in the trial. Because it may not be appropriate for all device types. There are device types that are preference sensitive. And to give you an example, if you have a device like a soft tissue filler where you're going to fill in the wrinkles in your face or your forehead or make your lips more full or whatever it is, that is a cosmetic improvement. It doesn't treat a health condition. And so the risk that a patient is willing to exchange for that added benefit is something that would be preference sensitive and would yield itself very nicely to a patient preference study. There are other conditions where you have an unmet need. It's a rare disease, and the device that's being developed has high risk, but there's no other alternatives. For example, you might have a patient who has an inherited retinal disease. They are virtually blind, very limited mobility, and you develop a device that allows them to see a little bit. But that device requires that you bore a hole in their skull, implant something in their eye, and subject them to multiple visits afterwards. Well, that is a high risk, potentially high benefit, but only probably for a small category of patients. That is also another preference-sensitive area. So we consider this information in addition to the clinical and non-clinical data that is submitted to us when we're making benefit-risk determinations. It doesn't change our review standards, but it does help balance those scales for us or tilt them in one direction or the other. Martin Ho and colleagues of mine at FDA published this article in Value in Health that shows kind of how we look at benefit risk and where patient preference may be useful. And as you can see, it's really along this axis that it's the most useful. But I will emphasize in this low benefit, high risk group, there are subgroups where it actually may help tilt our scales that we may say this device could be approved just for that indication. So I'm going to give you some examples of what we've done at CDRH, particularly in ophthalmics, to advance patient preference science. We've embarked on the patient-centered outcomes as common data elements for minimally invasive glaucoma surgical devices. And this is a joint effort with Johns Hopkins, the UCSF Stanford, the American Glaucoma Society, and the FDA. So just to give you context, glaucoma is a disease where you have damage to the optic nerve. Patients often lose their side vision first, and then they gradually start to lose their central vision at the very end stages. It is usually caused by elevation in intraocular pressure as well as other dynamics within the eye. It's a chronically progressive disease, and so there are various stages of the disease ranging from mild to severe. Minimally invasive glaucoma surgical devices are targeted for the mild to moderate stages of glaucoma. And so we want it, in that group, they have many treatment options. They can do drops to lower their eye pressure, they can have laser treatments applied, and they can have this surgical procedure. And you can see one of the minimally invasive glaucoma surgical devices planted right there in the eye. So we embarked on this partnership as part of the Centers of Excellence in Regulatory Science and Innovation. This is a formal collaboration between FDA and academic institutions across the country to help strengthen the regulatory science to transform and create innovation in product development. These research centers focus on the priority areas that FDA has identified in its strategic priorities. And Hopkins is one of these CIRSE centers. So this project is probably the first bi-coastal CIRSE collaboration that FDA has had. And our goal has been to determine patient preferences in glaucoma treatment with a focus on MIGS devices, and that's being done here at Johns Hopkins. The other one is to develop a patient-reported outcome measure assessing health-related quality of life in mild to moderate glaucoma patients. And that work is being done at UCSF Stanford. So due to the great direction of Tianjing Li and Jimmy Lee and Amanda's support, this project has made significant progress, and we've accomplished the first two aims. And now we are in the stage of developing a quantitative assessment of the trade-offs that patients are willing to make when weighing treatment options for glaucoma. So I won't steal their thunder in presenting you results for this, but I just want to let you know this is one of the efforts that FDA has been working on. The other one is at UCSF Stanford, and this is to develop the patient-reported outcome measure assessing health-related quality of life. Again, this project has made some good progress, and we're currently in the focus group testing for this development. So I mentioned that we're developing a patient-reported outcome measure, but I haven't really told you what a patient-reported outcome measure is. I'm sure many of you already know, but I'm going to go in a little bit detail of how we at FDA look at this. And this is probably where the meat of the talk will be. I have to start broad. Before we get to patient-reported outcomes, we have to start at the level of clinical outcome assessments. And that is any assessment that may be influenced by human choices, judgment, or motivation, and may support either direct or indirect evidence of treatment benefit. This definition has been agreed upon by not only FDA, but NIH through a joint partnership. We've worked diligently to create a glossary of terms so that we're all speaking the same language, so that NIH is not developing tools that cannot be used in FDA regulatory studies. There are 4 different types of clinical outcome assessments, which are listed here on the slide, and I will go through them all. However, regardless of the type of clinical outcome assessment, there are some very clear steps that have to be undertaken if you plan to use it in your clinical trial. And this is on the FDA website, the Clinical Outcome Assessment website at FDA. The first is to understand the condition that you're trying to intervene. That means know the onset, know the duration, know the population. If there is a bimodal expression of the disease, you need to know that, because how are you going to enroll those patients in the trial, and which group are you going to be targeting? How you assess a disease in children is going to be very different than how you would assess a disease in adults because of what they're able to do. You also need to know, are there treatment alternatives? And then what is the definition of a treatment benefit? All of that has to be understood before you even start thinking about your trial. Once you've got your device, you understand the disease, then what do you think your device is going to confer in terms of treatment benefit? Is it going to impact how the patient survives, how they function, or how they feel, which are the 3 things that usually these assessments assess. And then what is the context? Those 3 things are the concept of interest. And so you'll hear me use that term repeatedly throughout the talk. Then once you determine the concept of interest that you'd like to measure, you have to determine the context of use, meaning what is the criteria? Are you going to use it as entry criteria for your trial? Or are you going to use it as an endpoint in your trial? Is it going to be a phased approach where it's a screener before somebody's even eligible to be considered for the trial? All of that needs to be operationalized as you're thinking through what tool you're going to measure. And then once you determine the concept of interest, the context of use, you then can select your measurement. And you see the 4 of them in that category. So once you decide which one you're going to use, then you come over to this group and you look to see in the literature, is there an existing metric that does what I need it to do? If there is it just not quite right because maybe it wasn't studied in your intended use population? If that's the case, you need to do some modifications. If there is no measure that exists, then you enter the long pathway of development. So I'm just going to quickly go through some of the different outcomes. The first one is a clinician-reported outcome, and this is based on a report that comes from a trained healthcare professional after observation of a patient's health condition. It involves some clinical judgment, some interpretation of observable signs and behaviors or other physical manifestations. We, as clinicians, cannot directly assess symptoms that are known only to the patient. We cannot report pain intensity or something of that sort. Headache severity. We can't assess that. And so if a clinician-reported outcome purports to do that, it would not be accepted by the FDA. There are observer-reported outcomes as well. It's a measurement based on an observer that is not a healthcare professional. This could be a parent or a spouse or other non-clinical caregiver, but it should not include any medical judgment because they are not trained to give that, and it should only be on events or behaviors that are observable. So example, if you have a child who has low vision and you're counting how often they rub their eyes, that's something that's observable that a parent can capture. Coughing, vomiting, diarrhea, things of that sort. Proxy reported outcomes where the observer reports as if they are the patient are not valid endpoints and are not accepted. A performance outcome, which we all are probably familiar with. I see a lot of people wearing glasses, so you've all done a performance outcome before. It's a task where a patient is given instructions by a healthcare provider, and that is recorded. So a visual acuity test where you sit in the room, you cover one eye, you read the lines as far as you go down. The reason why a lot of clinicians tend to think that's an objective measure, but it is not. It is very subjective. It depends on the patient's motivation, depends on the examiner's motivation to encourage them to go further down. It depends on the conditions of the room. How is the lighting? How is the backlighting of the chart? All of that will impact the performance of the patient. And then lastly, patient-reported outcomes. We've already defined what that is. It can be measured either by self-report or interview, and they usually cover areas that are symptoms, meaning how prevalent are those symptoms, what is their impact on life, and how tolerable are they. They can look at symptoms and their impact on functioning or overall functioning, patient satisfaction, their expectations from therapy, health-related quality of life, which is a big bucket for everything else, and compliance. To help guide the development of patient-reported outcome measures, FDA issued guidance in December of 2009, and this guidance acknowledges the importance of appropriately and effectively incorporating the patient's voice into the evaluation of medical products. It's noteworthy that this guidance is for every single center at the agency. So when you're developing a PRO, these are the questions that you have to ask yourself in order to make sure that you're developing in a way that it's useful in a clinical trial. Is it appropriate? In essence, does the content address the relevant questions for the device? Is the questionnaire acceptable to patients? Does it look like what they expect it to look like? Is it easy to administer and process and analyze? Are the scores interpretable? How precise are the scores? Because you need to be able to separate signal from noise. Does it produce results that are reproducible and internally consistent? Does the questionnaire measure what it claims to measure? And does it detect changes over time in a way that matter to patients? So let's start first with appropriateness. This is the concept of interest in the context of use. The only way you can figure that out is by conducting patient interviews, focus groups with experts as well as patients across the spectrum of the disease severity. So it's qualitative in nature, and we really do examine these when they're submitted to us. We look at the transcripts, we look at the saturation grid. We're ensuring that you really had a thorough conversation with the patients to make sure that you've tapped into that concept of interest. It's also important to think about the recall period and if it's appropriate for the population or the disease state. Acceptability. This gets at how are you going to administer the questionnaire in your trial? Is it going to be the patient sits at a table and takes it by themselves, or is an interviewer going to give it? And it's not always appropriate for it to be self-administered. Let's say, for example, you have a very low vision population who they cannot read your questionnaire. An interviewer is the most accurate way to ensure completion of the questionnaire. Is it going to be on paper or on computer? And there are challenges with both of them. Are you going to use an item bank or traditional questionnaire measures, or are you going to use a diary? And then how are you going to structure that and capture the information? How long does it take for them to complete it? And how often do they have to complete it? All of these things will impact how much missingness you're going to have in your questionnaire. The format of the questionnaire is incredibly important. How it's laid out, the colors that are used, the font, and the wording, and the placement of instructions. All of that impacts how well patients understand what you're trying to measure. Language is something that we see this come up multiple times in our trial submissions where they say we're going to have English speakers. Well, they have English speakers in US and English speakers in Singapore. We speak different English. Our idioms are not the same. Our cultural norms are not the same. So how you ask that question has to be appropriate for all the populations you plan to enroll in your clinical trial. And that should be considered at the forefront of the development process. And then cost. Cost is always an issue, not just the training of staff, the printing of questionnaires. If you're going to buy electronic devices for patients, if you're going to develop an app and launch it to their platforms, whatever it is you're going to do has some cost. Interpretability gets at how meaningful are the scores, and what we really care about is it clinically meaningful? Not just do we see statistical differences between the groups, but does it mean something for patients? That's what tips our scales for benefit risk, as we talked about earlier. And sometimes it's not appropriate for an overall score to be computed. For example, if you're using the SF36, well, if I'm curious about the symptoms patients are having with your device, the SF36 may not capture those symptoms, and you may need to create a symptom-specific measure. And maybe it's not a score. Maybe it's each item. Maybe there's one particular item that I'm very concerned about. All of that should be considered when you're looking and planning your analyses. Precision is also something that oftentimes is not adequately considered in the PROs that we've seen develop. I told you we see 600 of them a year. And that we fight this battle when we talk to sponsors. How are you going to scale it? Is it going to be binary? Is it going to be a Likert or an adjectival anchors? Are you going to use a visual analog scale? And are you going to weight certain items more than others in your score computation? So all of that's going to be important. And if there are large floor and ceiling effects, then you're not going to have much discriminatory power, and it's going to be very difficult for you to show meaningful change in that population using that measure. So reliability and reproducibility, this is an important issue for every single clinical measure you have. It should be internally consistent and reproducible, and the degree to which the questionnaire is free from measurement error is important because it's going to help us determine how much of it is true change versus how much of it is just error or variability in the measurement tool. And we want to make sure that it yields the same results on repeated administrations without any intervention, because that helps us to have more faith in the results that you generate in your trial, because you will likely be administering it multiple times over the trial. Validity is the extent to which the questionnaire measures what it is intended to measure. And this goes back to the importance of qualitative research to support the concept of interest in the context of use. And the context of use includes the intended use population. It should have face validity and should have content validity. I will tell you that if you have not established content validity, it doesn't make sense to even try to look at construct or criterion validity or any of the other measures of validity, because if the content's wrong, it's not going to fit the purpose in the trial. So in order to establish content validity, there's many steps that have been fleshed out in our PRO guidance, and many of you who've developed PROs probably already know this, but you look at the literature, you look to see is there an existing tool, you get the opinion of experts, and then you develop a draft questionnaire that you're going to pilot with patients who have that particular condition, your target population, and then make revisions as necessary to ensure that you are adequately measuring the questionnaire, the concept of interest, and that the questionnaire is understandable to patients, the response categories make sense, and that the ordering of the items makes sense. And then you can embark on other quantitative analyses, which I have listed here on the slide. So responsiveness is the thing that we really care about. We're a regulatory body. We're looking at you do an intervention. Does it change how patients live? So your tool needs to be able to capture those health changes before and after the intervention, or if you're looking at different diseases or treatment states, because sometimes PROs are useful in diagnostic capacities. It has to be evaluated within the specific population, and it's not a fixed and inherent property of the questionnaire. For example, we've had many sponsors come to us and say, here's my questionnaire, it's valid, this is a clinically meaningful change. Well, they looked at a very different population you're looking at a very different population than where it was developed. Let's say this questionnaire was developed in patients who have heart disease. You're looking at cancer patients. They're not the same population. A clinically meaningful change in the cardiac population may be very different than a clinically meaningful change in the cancer population. So they have to determine the relevant and clinically meaningful effect size. So just some key things to remember as people are developing PROs. They're used when patients are the only source of information. We also use them when the clinical measures don't match patient symptoms. So in the world of ophthalmology, if you have dry eyes, patients also often come to us complaining of their eyes feel gritty or scratchy or their vision fluctuates over the course of the day. And we may look at them under our slit lamp, our microscope, and see nothing on their eye. Well, the clinical signs and the symptoms don't match, but both of them are important in making the diagnosis. So that's a time when you would also want to have a very good PRO. And we also use them when the clinical history needs to be structured and reproducible for trial purposes. For example, if we need to look at, are you actually using the device with the frequency that was prescribed in the labeling and dictated in the trial? Because if you're not, then if it's an at-home use device, we won't know if the lack of effect is due to non-compliance or truly due to the device not working. One thing is to be clear that you can't assume that a single tool can replace or be a proxy for another tool. You have to actually be able to show that first. The other thing is the relevant recall period. We've had a number of submissions where it's not even specified. And the problem with this is you create noise in your measurement. Patients anchor at very different time points. When we asked a population of patients to look at a questionnaire that had no recall period specified, some of them said, I thought about today. Some of them said, I thought about the past week. Some of them said, I thought over the past year what my symptom was. So you can see that creates significant noise. You have no idea really what you're measuring. And that's why it must be specified. And it should make sense relative to the disease or condition. If it is a waxing and waning condition, you should not be assessing it over a month period. You might need to ask for more frequent reports, or a diary might fit better to assess that condition. It should also account for the healing period. We're devices, and a lot of it requires surgery. So we need to take that into account when we're talking about the recall period. And it has to be accounted for in the administration schedule for the trial. We've had a number of sponsors submit PROs in their trials, and they may be assessing dry eye. And the question asks, how often have you had blurry vision or dry eye symptoms in the past month? Well, they're administering it at baseline, at 1 week, at 2 weeks, at 1 month, and at 2 months. You can clearly see there's significant overlap between those visits. So how am I going to differentiate anything in that space? I can't. So it really needs to be considered when you're developing your trial. The other thing is validity is the extent to which a questionnaire measures what it is intended to measure in the intended use population. It doesn't mean much to us for you to tell us it's valid if you haven't submitted any evidence to support that statement. And that means, what is the intended concept you want to measure? Does that tool actually measure that concept? And has it been studied in that population before? So I've made this point a number of times, and I keep making it because we continue to see this problem in our submissions. If the content is not adequate, then all subsequent statistical analyses are irrelevant. Factor analysis, item response theory does not address that issue. So the qualitative development work is critical. And we look at the evidence to make sure that it is truly valid for measuring the concept you state you want it to measure. Development process for PROs is iterative. A lot of times you end up changing items because of redundancy, or you might notice that there's some inter-item correlation that you want to remove. You may see that your instrument is currently scaled, is not able to detect change, or you may want to use it in a different severity population, so the items may need to be added or tailored to meet that particular population. So once you have your PRO, now you're going to use it in your clinical trial. And we get to the big question that many sponsors never answer. What's the endpoint? A PRO, the questionnaire, is not your endpoint. It is the tool to measure the concept, which is the endpoint. And I can tell you, in the majority of our submissions, this is not specified. They can be co-primary endpoints. You can use one as, you might have a PRO as a safety measure and also have a performance-based measure, and all of that can be your co-primary endpoint, but you need to specify what concept it is you're trying to get at. And the endpoint should match the intended claims. It's very clear in our regulation that we have to have transparency in labeling. If you are not clear about what you would like to accomplish and your trial is not well thought out, we can't allow claims to be listed in the labeling that are misleading to patients. Clinical significance, I've already told you, this is the thing we care the most about because that's how we weigh our risks and our benefits. A clinically meaningful change is the change that is important to patients. There are various methods to assess it, and there's no real consensus on how to do it. But I want to highlight two things. One is the impact of the baseline status on clinically meaningful. I told you about glaucoma. It's a spectrum of disease with mild and very severe patients. The baseline status of that patient, if they have mild disease, what is clinically significant to them is very different than the severe glaucoma patient. So that's important. Now, if I'm in this mild category, I have to also make sure that what is a meaningful change is not within the measurement, in the severe category, I have to make sure the meaningful change is not within the measurement error of the tool. If they say 2-point change is meaningful to me and my error is 2, that's not a meaningful change as far as we would consider in a regulatory study. We use the terminology responder definition, and I'm not sure if you all are familiar with it, but it's when we look at the intrapatient change. It is the trial-specific important difference or threshold applied at the individual level of analysis. In our guidance, we've made it very clear that we prefer anchor-based methods. And what an anchor-based method is, asking a patient, you might have your PRO, and you've got a score for the PRO for each patient, PRO measure score for each patient. You might ask them a question, how do you feel your health has changed after treatment? And they may say it's much improved, no change, much worse, and much worse. And so you've created categories, and you look at the scores for your PRO within each of those categories, and you would say, okay, the people who are much improved, this is what their average score is compared to those who did not change. This is our responder definition. And that is what we've accepted in a lot of different settings. It can be either for the rating of change or the rating of a concept, depending on what you're trying to measure. But I want to remind everyone that a responder definition is not just those who've improved. We also care about those who got worse. That's also part of a responder definition. And the cumulative distribution function that Capillary has already put out in multiple publications is what we have encouraged sponsors to submit to us. This is creating bins for each of the patients based on their change in their score from baseline. and plotting it. So it's very granular. We don't have to infer a threshold or anything else. We see all the data, and we can look at different responder definitions along that curve. As you see here, if this is a PRO where a lower score, a lowering of the score is improvement, we would expect the experimental treatment to be shifted to the left and the control treatment to be shifted to the right. And you can do statistical analysis to look at whether there's a significant difference between those two distribution curves. The next point that's important to consider in a clinical trial is missing data. There are a lot of reasons why data is missing. It can be due to dropout or compliance, but it can also be informative. Scott Como and Reza Esman published a paper from an FDA submission. It was actually a panel meeting. It was on a sexual performance device. And they looked at, there was a PRO that looked at sexual desire and sexual performance. Well, they found that patients who had low sexual desire never completed the sexual performance questionnaire. So the missing data was informative of desire. So those are the things that we really do look for, and you have to have a plan for combating any missing data. The other thing is ad hoc adjustments after the study's been done can lead to significant bias. If you're going to you should detail explicitly in your protocol how you're going to handle missing data. And one thing that we know is associated with missingness is the frequency of administration. The more often you get the PRO, the longer and more burdensome that PRO is, the more likely you are to have missing data. So make sure that when you're administering it, it's actually necessary for you to administer it. So we talked about all of these different steps, and the clinical outcome assessment is an iterative process. It goes around and around and around because you learn every time you use it, and you usually lead to some modification, maybe a shortening of the questionnaire, maybe a retailoring of certain items. But I put this up to show how involved this process is. So to summarize, you first want to define your disease population, considering the age of the population. And we've had trials, for example, inherited retinal disease is a blinding condition that happens in multiple age groups. It's a big genetic basket of different types of diseases. Some have onset in childhood, some have onset in their 20s and 30s, and others have onset in their 60s to 80s. So they're all in the same category, though, because it's a rare disease, and we think there's some commonalities in how they come about. Well, the questionnaire I'm going to give to somebody who's 80 years old is very different than the questionnaire I'm going to give to a 7-year-old or an 8-year-old, because what they're doing, what's important to them is very different if I'm interested in function. So that needs to be very clear. What is the concept of interest in the context of use? And that means where is it going to fit in your endpoint scheme? Then you select and you have to develop a well-defined and reliable outcome assessment. And then the clinical trial design has to be adequate. Masking and randomization is very important. If a patient knows what they're getting and they've been told this is going to help them see better, they're going to report that they're seeing better. We know that the placebo effect is definitely going to operate, and the suggestion bias from providers and everybody else seeing them. Randomization is also important as well because this is a very subjective measure. So we like to think that patients who are more likely to be negative and rate things poorly are evenly distributed between groups, as well as those who are always have that have rose glasses and think that everything's wonderful, that they're evenly distributed as well. That is the hope. You should pre-specify your approach to handling missing data and make sure that the method of the clinical outcome assessment administration is appropriate. The one thing that we continue to see is the absence of stated a priori analyses for PROs. It is analyzed after, and I'll tell you the reason why a lot of sponsors want PRO measures in their trials is because it helps with marketing. The label has to support the marketing. So they'll include them, but not plan an analysis, do it post hoc, and want that to help support their application. So we tell them repeatedly, it has to be stated a priori. You need to think about multiplicity based on how you decide you want to analyze that tool. Have a clear responder definition, and we want you to look at the results of the responder definition, give us the cumulative distribution function, and then look at the treatment effect. What are the mean differences between the two groups, and how does missing data, is it informative or not informative? So that is what we do on a daily basis, looking at these tools. But we've also spent time identifying measurement gaps. These are areas where there are questionnaires or tools, but they haven't been rigorously evaluated, or where there are tools, but they are outdated. For example, if you're looking at some of the National Eye Institute visual function questionnaires, this was before smartphones, tablets, a lot of things that we use now. We read books electronically, not on paper. And so that definitely will impact how we have to ask those questions. So those kinds of questionnaires may need to be changed. There are also areas where the technology creates symptoms or allows for new outcomes not previously measured or known. I can tell you that we've seen incredibly novel devices and things that we've never even thought about people could do or develop. So we don't have tools to measure it, and we're going to need to help the sponsor work towards developing something to capture that in their trial. So I'm going to give you some sampling of what we have done at FDA to help generate PRO measures to fill some of these unmet needs. The LASIK Quality of Life Collaboration Project was a collaboration between the Food and Drug Administration, the National Eye Institute, and the Department of Defense. We started this project because we heard at an advisory panel meeting from a number of patients who had significant problems with dry eyes, glare, halos, and other visual aberrations, with a few of them committing suicide. So their parents were there or their family members were there testifying to us about how devastating this procedure was on their life. So we embarked on this study to see how much of a burden is that for the population of patients who were having LASIK, which is an elective elective treatment that helps you not need glasses. It helps to clear your refractive error, improve your refractive error. It was a multi-phase study, and we looked at a population of people in the military, active duty military patients at the Navy Refractive Surgery Center in San Diego, as well as 5 civilian private practice and academic centers across the nation. One of them was Hopkins. And we pulled this information, we didn't pull it, we looked at it separately, but inferred that the findings from the military population, we wanted to know whether it be similar to what the civilian population reported in terms of how the questionnaire performed. We did the robust questionnaire development that I talked about before. We did cognitive interviews. These are the components of the questionnaire that we explored. And some of these things were not things that we thought were directly related to the device, but were relative to the findings that the patients told us during that advisory committee meeting, like the depressive anxiety symptoms and optimism and coping. Those are things we wanted to see if they were confounders of some of these outcomes. There were a lot of scales that we incorporated, and we developed these legacy items, like I said, we incorporated, and then we developed some new items. This is an example of one of the new items that we developed, and this is a definition of a symptom. It gives the image of how that symptom progresses towards severity, and gives different response options for the patient to answer with an anchored recall period. We did cognitive interviews with these questions, and we got feedback from patients who've had LASIK or who were contemplating LASIK. And what we found is that the questionnaire needed to be modified. We thought it was great. It needed some work. They suggested reordering. They suggested changing some items, cutting down on some items, making some wording a little bit clearer. And so we incorporated all this information and came up with our final questionnaire. We looked at approximately almost 600 patients. And you can see that the two studies, the military is PROW 1, the civilian population is PROW 2. And there were differences in gender. There was differences in ethnicity. But we thought that these two studies were very complementary of one another. But we found that the questionnaire performed similarly in both groups. You're looking particularly at the visual aberrations because these were the newly developed items that we made. And you can see that the reliability estimates are similar for all of them. When we looked at the prevalence of symptoms, you see the following distribution. It really didn't change much over postoperatively. This is a very qualitative study. This was an exploratory phase. I bring this up to say, well, the prevalence of symptoms, was that important? Is that important to us from a regulatory standpoint? Maybe, but we may care more about how bothersome they are because we're really looking at the impact on the patients. And you can say that visual symptoms were very or extremely bothersome in up to 4% of subjects without correction at 3 months. Well, we actually cared about something even further than that. Not just how bothersome it was, but how does it impact your daily activities? So we had a question that assessed that specifically. And we found that up to 1% of subjects without any correction, meaning no glasses after they had LASIK, experienced a lot of difficulty with or were unable to do their usual activities because of these symptoms. And this was informative for us. One, we knew that it wasn't a huge problem, that we needed to yank the device off the market, because that is also something we do. But it also lets us know that there are some patients that are having pretty bad and pretty incapacitating symptoms following this procedure. And patients should be informed about this before they make this decision to have this elective procedure performed. We also looked at satisfaction because this was brought up in multiple forms, and it's listed in our standards. We have international standards where we partner with different countries across the world to develop how we're going to evaluate medical devices in clinical trials. And satisfaction is one domain they wanted us to evaluate for LASIK. So we looked at that in our study, and we saw that greater than 96% of subjects were satisfied with their vision. So in summary, we were successful in developing this questionnaire, and we have made it publicly available because our goal was to have device manufacturers use this in their clinical trials. So now we have consistent approach to measuring these symptoms. We know how much they impact patients, and we can better inform the labeling so that patients can make educated decisions about having the treatment performed. We've also worked with the Foundation for Fighting Blindness. This is an advocacy group for patients who have inherited retinal degenerative diseases. And they held a focus group with about 22 patients to ask their perspective on living with the disease, what was their time course with the disease, and how has it impacted their life, and what things would they want to see happen to help improve their life. And the goal was to develop a PRO measure that may help better assess improvement with any device intervention. Because we know visual acuity is not going to be the best measure of device effectiveness in that population. And the last project I'd like to highlight is that we have a task force with the American Academy of Ophthalmology to develop a patient-reported outcome measure for intraocular lenses, particularly premium intraocular lenses. I mentioned to you before that this is of concern to payers as well as providers and patients. But primarily so when you have cataract surgery, let's say 10, 15 years ago, you'd have cataract surgery, we'd take out the cloudy lens that's inside your eye and replace it with an artificial lens that would allow you to see at distance, but it would not allow you to see well at close up or in intermediate computer distances. The technology has evolved over the past 15, 20 years so that we have lenses now that allow you to see well at distance and up close, and we have some lenses that allow you to see well at distance and in intermediate distances. So the technology is improving exponentially. We see new creative ways to do optics now that allow, hopefully, vision across the entire spectrum. Well, with that vision across the entire spectrum, because you're bending light at different angles, you create symptoms. And so we call those dysphotopsias, like glare when the headlights hit you, or contrast challenges. And so we have partnered with the Dunbar Hoskins Center of Quality Eye Care, and they have essentially set up a consortium where 3 device manufacturers have put in funds to do this. They're working together collaboratively, which is novel for devices because they never like to work together. But the American Academy of Ophthalmology was able to convince them to do so. They're also interested in measuring the concept of spectacle independence. And all of these tools, all these patient-reported outcome measures, we hope to have part of the medical device development tool program. The purpose of this program is to qualify tools that are used in development and evaluation of medical devices outside of the regulatory submission. So you get a tool and anybody can use it in their trial. They don't have to go through proving it to us each time it's used that it adequately assesses the concept of interest in the context of use. There was guidance published in November 2013 to tell you how to undergo this process, and we have a number of the tools that we've developed that are currently in that evaluation process. This is, as I said, a benefit to medical device manufacturers and to FDA because it shortens our review times. It increases innovation, so you don't have to spend time developing a tool if it already exists. And because a lot of people don't know what tools exist, particularly if it's proprietary. I may not publish it. I may not put it in any forum. The only way you know about it is if the developer decides to make it publicly known. And it also leads to more efficient regulation. Now we have a tool that may be used by multiple manufacturers in the same space. Other people can do comparative analyses of that. FDA doesn't do comparative analysis very much. We're starting to, but not very much. So in summary, patients are at the heart of what we do. Patients have unique perspectives about the value of benefits and impact of risks of medical device. We're committed to integrating the patient voice into our regulatory decision-making, and we all have a role to play in driving more patient-centric device development, evaluation, and delivery. So we're getting innovation from patients for patients. So to end in the profound words of Vanilla Ice, we would like to stop, collaborate, and listen to patients and involve them in our medical device evaluation process. Thank you. Take some questions if you have any. Sure.
So you talked about patient preference improvements and patient-reported outcome somewhat separately. although I see them as kind of complementary, and certainly patient preference instruments can inform some of the issues that you brought up with patient-reported outcomes instruments. So I just wondered if there's any effort to encourage researchers to integrate the two, maybe by developing them in conjunction with each other, or adapting currently accepted PROs to patient preference instruments.
So your question's two-pronged, I think, right? So the first question is, are we doing things to help encourage? Yes. We have identified certain preference-sensitive areas and have encouraged manufacturers in that area to consider patient preference studies as complementary evidence to their clinical trial. That being said, usually the patient preference study is separate from the clinical trial, which would incorporate the PRO assessment. There are places where we've seen the PRO assessment and we're not quite sure what the true effect size is, and we've encouraged manufacturers to do a preference study to help inform what may be a clinically meaningful effect size. So yes, we are definitely doing that at FDA. In terms of doing them together, I think probably the focus group development process could be done together because you're eliciting very similar concepts. However, the instruments are very different. The patient preference instrument is usually a risk-benefit trade-off. So you're creating scenarios for patients and asking them if you're going to have let's say we're using weight loss. You're going to have a 3-pound weight loss, but you're going to have significant nausea. 50% of you are going to have significant nausea, and 20% of you are going to have incapacitation for 6 weeks or whatever it is. And we give you that. Are you willing to accept device A or device B with its particular profile? That's very different than a PRO measure, which is going to ask you, over the past week, how often have you experienced dry eye symptoms? How bothersome were those symptoms to you? So they're very different concepts.
And so I agree. At the same time, if they were developed in conjunction, you might know what level of dry eye someone is willing to trade off. Whereas currently, when I look at some PROs, for instance, I'm working on the EPIC 26 and prostate cancer, trying to adapt that to understand the preferences of patients is very difficult because it was developed in a really different manner.
Right.
Whereas if they were developed together, it might be easy to say, well, this is how much dry eye you're seeing with this device, and this is how much this particular patient population cares about that particular symptom.
Yeah, we don't disagree, but I can tell you a device manufacturer is not going to wait 2 years to do that. So what the challenge is a lot of them have elected to, I'll put it like this. We've seen patient preference studies in areas where there's not a huge benefit from their device. That's where we typically see it. If the device is a slam dunk, there's no need for the patient preference information. It's not going to change our benefit risk weighing of the two. But if there is a marginal benefit, yes, it may be helpful for them, but that's their business decision. We don't impose, we don't require, we just let them make their own decision. We suggest. And I can tell you a lot of the PRO development, the study that we did took many, many years to finish. And if you're talking about patient preference study on top of that, many years, much cost. And device manufacturers are usually a little reticent to take on more costs if they don't need to. No problem. Yes. Go ahead.
So I like the taxonomy a lot, and the different types of sort of outcomes. I'm interested in, especially as you see more sort of big data and mobile use, about whether you've seen what your thoughts on how to design studies that, instead of completely asking patients to report outcomes, might sort of ask clinicians and patients to be able to track some element of what they're reporting during their day. So it's sort of, in some ways, it's about observation, but it's observing not just the observing, but actually observing, say, text the patient is generating observations. How to think about that? Is it a thorough observation, or is that
So we have done studies where we've looked at blog sites and we've mined them for, are there negative comments about this device, positive comments, and categorize them. and form some information about patient preferences based on that information. There have been a couple of websites, Patients Like Me, I'm not sure if you're familiar with that website, and so they do a lot in terms of getting permission from those patients to access a lot of their information. So we have a draft guidance on real-world evidence. And what you're talking, so you've got 3-4 concepts that you've mentioned. One, real-world evidence, which is a guidance document that we have. Mobile apps, which are regulated by CDRH as well, and our division's actively involved with those. That is a whole different regulatory paradigm too. And so when you're talking about merging the two, it depends on how they're used as to how much we get involved in it. Because our purpose is to just regulate medical devices. The practice of medicine is the practice of medicine. Social interaction, it's fine. But if they want to come and support a device application, then if they want to use it as real-world evidence, they need to meet the specifications of that guidance document that clearly defines what we consider to be a valid use of real-world evidence. If they want to use mobile apps, some of them, general wellness apps, are outside of our enforcement. We don't monitor those. And a lot of those apps do look at general wellness things, so that's outside of ours. But there are some apps that are diagnostic devices for certain clinical conditions, which we do regulate. And so in those, we'd be actually involved in the app itself, as well as what data is generated from that app. Yes? Okay. I'm sorry, I couldn't hear what the question exactly was. So you asked about whether or not I've been involved in projects that deal with patient preference or PRO measures in the diabetic population or the hypertensive population. I haven't been directly involved. We have had significant patient preference work in that space. In fact, Kidney International, I believe, worked with the FDA to develop a patient preference study looking at home dialysis. So there are many ophthalmologists, one area that we're doing this in. We're doing it in kidney disease, cardiovascular disease. So it depends on which areas there's a champion for it and how motivated the sponsors are, or the manufacturers are, to pursuing it. Because our regulation states that we don't tell you what your endpoint should be. We don't tell you what your concepts should be that you're measuring. You get to decide all that. However, if there's something that we think you've glaringly left out, we give guidance, but you're not obliged to do it. So some spaces are a little bit more enthusiastic about developing patient-reported outcome measures than others. Yes? So you bring up a good point. That is exactly what we struggle with. In fact, most of our submissions, at least in my space, every company is individually developing their own PRO measure. So I know they're looking at the same concept. I know what they're doing, but I can't tell one company what I've seen another company do. Some of them have done pretty good development work. Others, not so much. They wrote it themselves as their epidemiologists made the clinical trial. And we look at each submission individually. It has to stand on its own. We don't compare across devices, even within the same device space. So it has to be a self-contained unit anyway. Part of the qualification process that exists not only at CDRH but also at CEDAR is to get tools that everybody accepts as being a valid assessment of that concept so that manufacturers do use the same tool. But we cannot force that. And it's up to their own decision, their own discretion about what tool they decide to use to measure that concept.
Thank you very much.
you.